Professor Walzer, Professor Halberstadt, distinguished guests, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me, and also an honor, to open this symposium and the annual Buber Lecture to commemorate 50 years to the passing of Martin Buber. Martin Buber, as you all know, was the first president of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Five years ago, we have started the tradition of an annual Buber Lecture as part of the activities of the Humanities to commemorate 50 years to the passing of Buber. And it will be delivered by Professor Michael Walzer, who is a Professor Emeritus at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. Professor Walzer will be presented in a few minutes by Professor Halberstadt. But before that, I would like to invite you, Professor Walzer, to receive the medal that we give to all Buber lectures, which is the Buber Medal. And so this is Martin Buber. So this is to you, and I congratulate you in advance for your talk. And all that I have to do now, or would like to do now, is to congratulate all the participants of the conference and to wish you both a very interesting lecture today and also a very successful and interesting symposium in the next few days. And now I would like to ask Professor Halberstadt to present Professor Walzer.
Well, good evening, and it's really wonderful and a great honor to introduce. It's a great honor to introduce Professor Michael Walzer as our Martin Buber lecturer, opening the symposium on the thought of Martin Buber. Michael Walzer is one of the most important political theories of our time. His work spans through the most essential questions of politics, starting from just and unjust wars, that has been a seminal work in every discussion, every contemporary discussion on the questions of morality and just. This is collateral damage, Michael. So just and unjust war has been really seminal for every discussion on just war since the publication of Michael's book. Professor Walzer has dealt with issues of distributive justice in his spheres of justice, where he introduced another paradigm of dealing with the problem of equality, asking not whether and how we distribute equally goods among people, but in what way we constrain the dominance of particular goods and not allowing illegitimate exchanges from one advantage to another. Michael Walzer has done an important work in questions of liberalism and nationalism, challenging the idea that the only criterion for a liberal state is state neutrality, supporting this idea of the community right to a common good that is expressed politically in an organized political community. And besides his great intellectual achievements, has been also an important engaged public intellectual, dealing, among other things, with matters of the State of Israel and its politics. Michael, it always feels as if you're running the State of Israel from far in your head. And the latest work relates to some contemporary issues. The latest book that Michael has published, The Paradox of Liberation, it's a comparative work about India, Algeria, and Israel, dealing with the structure of three national movements that are based on a strong secular ethos, repressing or denying the ties of their communities to religious voices, and then the coming of the repressed back to haunt those structures. Besides all these things, I think what makes Michael a great lecturer on Buber in particular, there are two aspects of his works that deal with Buber's thought. One is his work on social criticism and interpretation and social criticism, the nature of social criticism, its practice. In his book, The Company of Critics, Buber is one of the heroes exemplifying the praxis of social criticism. And the other thing, I think it's more important in terms of your dialogue with Buber, is your work on the Jewish political tradition. The 3 volumes that are published with Noam Zohar and Menachem Loberboim, and your work on biblical political theology, In the Shadow of God. In the Shadow of God. Michael has written a book on the political thought of the Bible called In the Shadow of God, where I think there you see a kind of a tense dialogue with Buber. Buber embraced the kind of divine anarchy of biblical theological tendency. What Michael sees the kingdom of God as shadowing and sucking almost biblical tradition from real political conversation. Here is an interesting debate or exchange in terms of your work and Buber's work. I would say one thing that is common to all this great, prolific, and deep writing of Michael. Every line of it is elegant. Michael is an elegant thinker. You read him, you're not going to see, analytical fireworks, examples from twin earth or counterfactuals. It's very wise. There is a lot of wisdom, deep and sensible judgment, and that shines in every line of Michael's work. And for that reason, we gathered here eager to listen to what you have to say about communities and nations. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to the lecture.
I don't think I have ever spoken to an audience that includes so many friends. This doesn't make me less nervous. But I am very happy to be here, and I want to thank Moshe Haboto for a very friendly introduction. In 1947, Martin Buber published a political book that readers who knew him only as a religious philosopher, a biblical scholar, and a master of Hasidic texts must have found surprising. The central themes in Paths in Utopia had figured before in Buber's life. As a young man, he'd moved in anarchist socialist circles, and the chapter on Gustav Landauer could have been read as a belated tribute to a close friend whose essays and articles Buber had edited after Landauer's murder in 1919. But the chapters on Proudhon, Kropotkin, Marx, and Lenin are pretty much without precedent in his previous publications. The chapters display a remarkably detailed knowledge. Buber seems to know every one of Marx and Lenin's articles and their letters too. He knows these two almost as well as he knows Rabbi Nachman, though with less sympathy. I first read Paths in Utopia a long time ago when I was a young socialist, and I found it very impressive. Rereading it now as an old socialist, it is impressive still. But after some 67 years, it requires some reconsideration. The book is a sharp attack on state socialism, represented by Marx and Lenin, and a strong defense of communitarian socialism, best represented by Landauer. But it is also, most simply, an attack on the state and a defense of community. Buber opposes what he calls the political principle in the name of the social principle. The argument is a kind of socio-political enactment of Buber's religious philosophy. Community in its finest versions and its most intense moments is a collective realization of the I-thou relationship, whereas state officials deal with their subjects in an I-it relationship. The book includes a lovely description of the Zionist kibbutzim, an experiment in community that, he says, did not fail. And it ends with a famous line announcing that the choice for humanity lies between the two poles of socialism, one of which is represented by Moscow, and the other, he writes, I would make bold to call Jerusalem. The choice is between the state in what Buber took to be its fully realized, that is, its totalitarian form, and the community in what he imagined to be its very young or seedling form. Well, I'm on the one hand glad, and on the other hand very sad to tell you that this Moscow-Jerusalem dichotomy does not represent the critical alternative that humanity faces today. In fact, I can't give our choices proper names. They are more complex than they seemed in 1947, and the alternative possibilities are not clearly embodied in particular geographic locations. In this lecture, I want to ask what remains of value in the rest of Buber's argument, and in order to address that question properly, I will contrast Martin Buber, the communal Jew, with Leon Blum, the state Jew, and also, this will be more familiar, with David Ben-Gurion, the Jew of Mamlachtiyut. I will be greatly helped in making these comparisons by Pierre Birnbaum's new biography of Leon Blum, which comes some 20 years after his brilliant study, The Jews of the Republic, A Political History of State Jews in France. And I've also been helped by the young Israeli scholar Nir Kadar, who has been writing recently on Ben-Gurion and Mamlachtiyut. Though Buber's description and defense of community appear in a book called Paths in Utopia, his doctrine is not utopian, at least not in the nowhere sense of that word. In an inaugural lecture delivered at the Hebrew University in 1938, almost immediately after he arrived here, the lecture is called Plato and Isaiah, Buber writes that the Hebrew prophet does not confront man with a universally valid image of perfection, a pantopia or utopia. Neither has he the choice between his native land and some other country more suitable to him. In his work of realization, he is bound to the topos, to this place, to this people, because it is the people who must make the beginning. Buber, too, is bound to this place, to this people. His community must be realized on the ground, in what we used to call the real world. It follows from this very concrete grounding that the community, though it makes I-thou relationships possible, cannot organize its affairs and plan its common work through those relationships alone. As the communitarian theorist Amitai Etzioni writes in an article on Buber, quote, authentic communities combine an inevitable I-it or instrumental grouping with an I-thou bond. The social principle lives, so to speak, alongside or within the political principle. The community lives within the state, or Buber would say the state must encompass and protect a community of communities. This is definitely a minimalist state. Buber warns again and again against its expansionist tendency, which he takes to be natural to the political principle, against what he calls the excessive state. He thinks that the state always has a kind of surplus power. It always has more power than it needs for its legitimate tasks. This constant difference, he writes, between the state in principle and the state in fact is explained by the historical circumstance that accumulated power does not abdicate except under necessity. In other words, the state will never wither away. Buber did not believe that the dictatorship of the proletariat would be temporary, nor did he think that it could be legitimate. He understood very well the statist implications of Marxism and the stronger statism of Lenin, and he rejected both. How then do communitarian socialists deal with the state? Despite its legitimate tasks, they have to struggle constantly against it, or at least against its surplus power. This is Buberian realism. The existing communities, through the voluntary engagements of their members and through the ties they construct among themselves, these communities must exert vigorous pressure on the power accumulated by the state. The extent of legitimate state coercion is determined by the strength of the associated communities. The more capable they are of governing themselves, the less the state should be doing. But what the state actually does is determined by the pressure that the communities exert. It is an ongoing contest. Buber is reluctant, and I think wrongly reluctant, to provide his own account of the state's legitimate and necessary functions. But if we reflect on his and Landauer's description of community, we will realize very quickly that the list of state functions is likely to be fairly long. Consider just one crucial aspect of communal life described by Landauer and reported in Paths and Utopia with strong approval by Buber. This is Landauer. Socialism, freedom, and justice can only be accomplished among people who have always been united, Landauer writes, and he then goes on to describe the nature of the union. It depends on the closeness of people to one another in way of life, language, tradition, and memories of a common fate. For all this predisposes to communal living, and only by building up such a life can the peoples of the earth constitute themselves anew. Constitute themselves anew. This description is meant to encompass both large and small communities, nations, and communes, though Landauer's chief interest was in the commune. In March 1919, shortly before his murder, he corresponded with Nachum Goldman about the kibbutz and promised to attend a meeting in Munich to discuss Jewish settlements in Palestine. According to Manesh Sperber, the kibbutzim fulfilled Landauer's dream of community. Indeed, Landauer's call for a return to the land, in Germany to be sure, and his call for the union of intellectual and manual labor sounds like something from the Second Aliyah he was writing in 1909. But it was Buber who made the kibbutz his primary example of how men and women would constitute themselves anew. So let's think about the closeness of the kibbutz, which is perhaps its central feature. The early theorists of the communal settlements in Palestine would have said that they represented a radical break with exilic life, with Jewish tradition, with Jewish memories. And in many ways, that's right, they did. But there is one way in which the kibbutz was exactly like the medieval kahal. Its members were all of them Jews. Good Jews, bad Jews, that didn't matter. As Rashi wrote long ago, even bad Jews are still Jews. The kibbutz and the kahal were typical communities in that they were radically homogeneous. Insofar as they were self-governing, they were communities of Jews governing Jews. There were no strangers, no others, for whom the members were responsible. Of course, there are many different kinds of communal closeness, but all of them establish a boundary between members who share whatever it is that drives their association and non-members who don't. Homogeneity is a central feature of community. It is not a central feature of states, which are always heterogeneous, which always include strangers, despite the efforts of some of their citizens to turn the state into a community and deny membership and sometimes even entry to strangers. I believe that one of the difficulties of the Jewish transition from statelessness to statehood is the simple fact that for almost 2,000 years, we had no experience of governing anyone but ourselves. Many of us did not, and some of us still do not, understand the most important of the legitimate tasks of the state to defend the physical well-being and the human rights of all the people who find themselves within its borders. States are not communities. They have their own unity, which is not, however, as close as that of a commune, and which does not depend on a single way of life or a single set of memories. Citizenship extends across communal boundaries. It is the status not only of the ethnic, cultural, or religious majority, but of all the minorities. The majority can sustain its culture. In a democracy, that should be a natural process, but it cannot distribute rights, entitlements, and prerogatives on the basis of cultural identity, only on the basis of a common citizenship. The state that first made this commonality, this inclusiveness, effective and visible was France. I mean the French Republic after the Revolution, and among the leading beneficiaries of French inclusiveness were the state Jews of France, whose devotion to the Republic Pierre Birnbaum has chronicled and celebrated. The greatest of the state Jews was Leon Blum. I think it's curious that Blum, the statist, has a kibbutz named after him, but Buber, the communitarian, doesn't, except for a summer youth kibbutz in Bealsville, Maryland. The French state, Birnbaum writes, was the guarantor of equal access to public space for all its citizens. It made it possible for a Jewish civil servant, in fact, for several Jewish civil servants, to become prime minister. For Leon Blum as prime minister, the state was much more than the protector of the associational life of civil society. It was the key agent of equality and social reform in civil society itself. His Popular Front government of 1936 was not a dictatorship of the proletariat. He would have thought that an example of an excessive state, but it was a strongly centralized regime whose power, Blum declared, would be used, quote, to define, protect, and guarantee the condition of the working class. One of the first achievements of that regime was the establishment, top-down, by legislative decree, of a 2-week vacation with pay for all French workers. That summer, Blum received a torrent of postcards from workers thanking him for their first family vacation. Some of them addressed him as Citizen Leon Blum, some of them as Comrade Blum. He was a citizen of the Republic and a comrade in the community of socialists. I'm going to come back to this important combination, citizen and comrade, in a little while. There is another task of the Republican state that Blum championed a few years later in 1938, to uphold the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. Only a strong state can protect these stateless people. Your house may already be full, Blum wrote. That may be, but when they knock at your door, you will open it, and you will not ask them for their birth certificates or criminal records or vaccination certificates. Anything else, he said, would not be in keeping with French or Republican tradition. This is one of Blum's finest moments, and I have to say that it was not one of Martin Buber's finest moments. For Buber's opposition to political Zionism and therefore to Jewish statehood made it impossible for him to demand an open door to Palestine for increasingly desperate Jewish refugees. You need a state to open the doors. And I hope it is needless to say, when you have a state, you must keep the doors open so that desperate people can come in. This understanding of the inclusiveness of statehood was also, I think, Ben-Gurion's understanding. The word mamlachtiyut, apparently his invention, is usually translated statism. But I think, following Nir Kadar, that civism is a better translation. Ben-Gurion was trying to describe what it means to be responsible for a state. He was speaking to people for whom the state had always been, as he said, a hostile regime that often drove them for survival's sake to deceive its officials and ignore its laws. Mamlachtiyut is the very opposite of that exilic mentality. It suggests instead a sense of being instated in the world. It implies an acceptance of the obligations and commitments that come with statehood, to seek the well-being of all the inhabitants of the state, to work for the common good, the general welfare. Among those of Ben-Gurion's writings that I know, his best statement of this civic commitment came in December 1947, only a few days after the UN vote for partition, in a speech to the leaders of Mapai. And I have to stress that this was not a speech addressed to foreign journalists. It was delivered in Hebrew to his fellow Mapainiks. And this is what he said. We must think in terms of a state, in terms of independence, in terms of full responsibility for ourselves and for others. In our state, there will be non-Jews as well, and all of them will be equal citizens, equal in everything without any exception. That is, the state will be their state as well. The attitude, this is still Ben-Gurion, the attitude of the Jewish state to its Arab citizens will be an important factor, though not the only one, in building good neighborly relations with the Arab states. The striving for a Jewish-Arab alliance requires us to fulfill several obligations, which we are obliged to do in any event: full and real equality, de jure and de facto, of all the state's citizens, gradual equalization of the economic, social, and cultural standard of living of the Arab community with the Jewish community, recognition of the Arabic language as the language of the Arab citizens in administration, courts of justice, and above all in schools, municipal autonomy in villages and cities, and so on. Well, Ben-Gurion was certainly too optimistic about the possibility of a Jewish-Arab alliance, and maybe a little presumptuous in including culture in his talk of equalization. Nor did he and the governments he later led live up to the commitments he described here. Nonetheless, this was the language of a statesman, someone who understood the political, legal, and moral responsibilities that would come with sovereignty. I don't think that Buber, once he had reconciled himself to the failure of the binational project, would have disagreed with anything in Ben-Gurion's speech. They disagreed about a lot of things, but I don't think Buber would have disagreed with anything in the text that I just read you, although Buber did not hope for neighborly relations with Arab states, but for a Middle East federation in which Israel would be included. Once the state was established, Buber fought with great steadiness for minority rights, for Arab rights. Sometimes in the course of that fight, he seems to acknowledge the value of sovereignty, as in a speech in 1957 when he said that for the first time in 2 millennia, the Jewish people, quote, has the power to determine for itself in no small measure its institutions, its way of life, and its relations to other nations. What is that power, if not sovereignty? Zionists had always argued correctly that the Jews needed a state to protect themselves. Buber argued also correctly that they needed a state to fulfill their moral obligations, the same obligations that Ben-Gurion had stipulated. But there is nothing in Buber's more systematic political thought, nothing in Paths in Utopia, that suggests the critical link between state power and minority rights. The critical link, that the state is the necessary agent of rights enforcement. It is also, obviously and often, the agent of rights violations. The excessive state violates rights. Buber understood that very well. But rights are also violated all the time in civil society itself, which includes closed communities, profit-seeking companies, xenophobic political parties, hierarchical religious organizations, and predators of many different kinds. Only a strong state can deal with all this, a state like the one that Leon Blum led for much too short a time in the mid-1930s. The French Republic at that moment was a state under vigorous pressure from a powerful labor movement and a short-lived but memorable socialist insurgency. But this wasn't the kind of pressure that Buber later described in Paths in Utopia. In fact, when citizens pressed the state, as it was pressed in 1936, they're not trying to limit its power or to force its abdication. They are demanding that its power be used in a certain way and not in other ways. At the same time, vigorous political action by citizens creates a kind of community, not perhaps exactly Buberian in character, but close enough. I want now to describe some communities of that kind, which I believe he would have admired. The totalizing communities that Buber wrote about were communities of production and consumption, where every aspect of the common life, from the raising of children to the division of labor, the scheduling of everyday work, every aspect is shaped by the members either consensually or through democratic debates and majority decisions. Communities of that kind have not reproduced themselves across civil society as he imagined they would. Not in Israel and not anywhere else. Indeed, they have not survived in their original form. The kibbutz commune has become, in the best of cases, a miniature social democratic welfare society. It is well to pause, my friend Leonard Fine wrote just last year. It is well to pause in honor of the nobility of the kibbutz experiment, and perhaps to hope that newer forms of communal association will in time be developed. He mentions the proliferation of urban kibbutzim here in Israel, some of which, he says, may prove more than ephemeral. But right now, the Israeli state is not pressed by the kibbutz or the kibbutz movements in the direction of Buberian justice. Contemporary states do, however, come under pressure from associated citizens. And these associations are communities of a kind in which the values that Buber celebrated are realized for a time. Perhaps we should not be too critical of ephemeral communities. Perhaps the forms of association and solidarity that resemble or make possible I-thou relationships are necessarily short-lived, but also possibly recurrent. Think of the tent city on Rothschild Boulevard a few years ago, or of Occupy Wall Street in the United States, or if you believe, as I do, that these were too short-lived, think of, I'll use American examples, the labor movement of the 1930s, or the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or the feminist movement of the 1970s. Movements of this sort are enactments of the old leftist slogan, which could have been written by Marx or Lenin but wasn't: the liberation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. Liberation for any group must be self-liberation. And as the great revisionist Edward Bernstein argued, the liberation process, the work, is more important than the final goal. I suspect that Buber would agree with this claim. I suspect that the people he felt closest to were not the imagined citizens of a future communitarian society, but rather the activists and militants struggling right now to bring it about. That was certainly Landauer's view. In 1907, he published a remarkable little book called The Revolution, in a series edited by Buber. Edward Bernstein wrote The Strike for the same series. Landauer argued that, quote, no revolution will ever achieve its goals. Revolution is a means in itself, It serves the revitalization of force and spirit. That's a romantic view, no doubt, which isn't entirely my own. But let me complete Landauer's description. During revolutionary times, he wrote, people are captured by a spirit of joy. What is essential for this joy is that humans no longer feel lonely, that they experience unity, connectedness, and collective strength. Well, I like to think that I'm not romantic about political action, so I will now attempt a matter-of-fact account, not of revolution, but of what might be called a movement moment, avoiding, if I can, what the young Franz Rosenzweig called Buber's ecstasies. This is a story about my hometown, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was in the 1930s a steel town, pretty much owned by Bethlehem Steel, a second-tier American company. The older workers in the Johnstown mills were from Western Europe, mostly from Ireland and Germany. The younger workers were from Eastern and Southern Europe, mostly Poles, Slovaks, and Italians. Bethlehem Steel did not hire Jews or blacks. There was a company store, and there was no union. Johnstown was the place where the little steel strike of 1937 was broken. The attempt to organize a union decisively defeated. But my story doesn't end there, for the American state intervened. Or better, the US government, then in Democratic hands, intervened, first with a Senate investigation, which revealed that the mayor and members of the city council were on the payroll of the steel company, and then with a legal order from the newly formed National Labor Relations Board that the workers be polled on the question of unionization. They voted 4-1 for the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and a union was organized. But the passive voice was organized, which is so common in academic writing about events like this, isn't right. What really happened in Johnstown on the ground, starting in the late 1930s and continuing into the 40s, was a political mobilization. Organizers came from outside, most of them socialist and communist militants sent by the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, many of them Jewish, but they weren't the important figures in my story. The people we should remember were the men and women who responded to their efforts. People previously passive and inarticulate, who never imagined themselves as political agents, began to speak out and to act. They organized meetings, stood up to complain about working conditions in the mills and about the poverty of steelworker families. They asked the classic political question, what ought to be done? Buber had argued in 1919 that the right question is, what must I do? Also a good question, which was asked and answered in Johnstown in the 1930s. The steelworkers and their families, they wrote leaflets, they ran picket lines, they negotiated with the police, they encouraged one another and pleaded with workers who held back. Their watchword was solidarity. They won their fight, established a union, and elected some of themselves as its first officers. What happened next is less inspiring. The children of the militants inherited the union and didn't have to fight for it. That moment of intense activity didn't last. As sociologists say, the movement was routinized. It became routine. And now, some 75 years later, the mills are closed and empty. The union is no longer a presence in Johnstown, and there probably is no union or no effective independent union in Brazil or China where the steel is currently produced. Still, that moment of political creation, I won't be so matter-of-fact now, that moment, those years when men and women came alive as articulate agents of their own destiny, when they joined together to constitute themselves anew, that is, it seems to me, a time of supreme human value. It is a joyful time, an I-thou moment, and I don't think it matters that it is momentary, so long as we understand that it is or can be recurrent, we are allowed to hope that it will happen again. Of course, the I-thou moment is also much of the time an I-it moment. Think of negotiating with the police, collecting union dues, arguing about who has to be on the picket line at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. More important, the Senate investigators and the National Labor Relations Board officials, however sympathetic they were, and their sympathy was critically important, they were not part of the community of workers. They were agents of the state, and they worked in state-like fashion. But without them, the movement moment would have ended very quickly and without joy. Its success depended on the fact that the Johnstown workers were American citizens as well as union comrades. Their closeness, their solidarity was not only protected, it was fostered by the more distant ties of citizenship. Like the workers in Leon Blum's France, they won paid vacations with more than a little help from political friends and state officials. The self-determination of the workers of Johnstown required state action. But this had to be the action of a state that was theirs, of which they were citizens. And this is true of every subject group that aims to end its subjection. But there is more that has to be said about the help that we all need from the state. The excitement and intimacy of movement moments isn't experienced only by people we admire. Workers organizing unions, or Black Americans demanding their civil rights, or feminists arguing for gender equality, or Jewish pioneers organizing kibbutzim. Religious zealots and nationalist and fascist militants also experience moments of great intensity and solidarity. Moments, in Landauer's words, of unity, connectedness, and collective strength. But we would deny them joy if we could. And we look to the liberal state to protect the men and women that they would persecute or expel or kill. Not every community is worthy of celebration. Communal joy can also be communal zeal, expressed as hatred of the alien others. Communities are maximally ugly, I think, when they are gathered around a maximal leader, when their solidarity is vertical as well as horizontal. It is important, therefore, to stress the exclusively horizontal commitment suggested by one of Buber's titles, the book called Between Man and Man. That's not the whole story for him, but from the standpoint of politics, it is exactly right. The crucial value that good communities realize is radical equality, a sudden collapse of hierarchical relations that is signified by the word comrade. It doesn't last, but the lesser equalities sustained by the state, equality before the law, equality of opportunity, they can last, and they set limits to what we might think of as communal excess. Buber celebrated communities of production and consumption. I have celebrated communities of struggle. It turns out that neither of these offers a long-lasting solution to the difficulties of human social life. Neither of them is the good society, a phrase whose singularity I have never found attractive. There are many good societies, and some of these give rise to moments of intensity and exhilaration and of concrete achievement. But these moments are followed, always followed, by longer periods of routine existence. I said a moment ago that we should not be too critical of ephemeral communities. We should also not be too critical of social routines. Moments of struggle and insurgency can sometimes improve the routines by disrupting them, sometimes by replacing them. But the improvements come through state action, and they are sustained, which is to say routinized, by the continuing efforts of state officials to promote collective bargaining, to enforce civil rights, to improve welfare provision, to defend women against violent men, and so on. Each of you can extend the list. Everybody needs a state. I should add that the struggle to establish a state has its own moments of communal exhilaration and camaraderie, its own I-thou moments. It also has its moments of chauvinist intensity and nationalist fervor, which the established state, if it is to be a decent state, will have to repress. Once they have a state of their own, men and women will associate for many reasons, good and bad, and some of these reasons will sometimes give rise to insurgent movements, demanding that the state do this or stop doing that it uplift the poor, for example, and stop protecting the riches of its richest citizens. Only the state, the agent of a newly formed collective will, can act in these ways. Contra Marx, it will never act once and for all and then disappear. It will have to do what it has to do again and again. Contra Buber, even the best, the strongest human communities will need the ongoing assistance of a strong state. It isn't romanticism simply that led Buber and Landauer to celebrate the experience of community. This is indeed a valuable human experience. We cherish those forms of communion that we call friendship and love, which, with all their vicissitudes, can last a long time. But our lives are also enhanced by wider communions of work and struggle, which don't last a long time, but still lift us up, lift our spirits, and sometimes also improve our everyday existence. But existence itself, our common life, our health and prosperity, our strength and culture, our science and culture, all this requires the political formation that we call the state. Sovereignty is a universal value, even if it can only be realized in particular places. Everybody needs a state that protects them and the others with them. The whole of Jewish history testifies to this need, and having learned the lesson, we have taught it to other people, not always intentionally. Critics of Buber might slyly suggest that he would be more likely to recognize the needs of those other people than he was decades ago to recognize the needs of his own people. But I like to think that right now, in the world we live in, he would agree that before anything else, everybody needs a state, a strong state, a decent state, a state of their own, Tibetans and Kurds and Palestinians, and yes, the Jews too. Thank you. Sure.
So thank you very much. We have some time for some questions. Anybody would like questions, not statements. But
Oh, statements are okay.
everybody needs a statement.
Yes, I suppose it does. I'm trying to get at what Ben-Gurion meant by it. Yes, it is like much of political Hebrew. It is an invention made necessary by statehood. There is this story about Ben-Gurion in London in 1943. When he was taken to a restaurant where you didn't need ration cards, and it is said that he was taken by some wealthy Jews, presumably donors, to this restaurant, and he blew up. He exploded at them. He said, "How can you break the laws of a country that is fighting Hitler?" Mamlaktiyut is the opposite of what those Jews were doing in England in 1943. Right. Well, I think I did recognize that there are lots of bad communities, just as there are bad states, and the state has to protect members of communities that are hierarchical. Like the state should not allow a religious community to deny education to its girls. So the state often has to intervene to protect members of communities, and sometimes the state will have to intervene against communities that produce violent action. Yes, I'm not. I meant to celebrate some kinds of communities and some kinds of states. You better stand up so I can hear you here. Well, you can't have communities. You can't have states without boundaries. And I was convinced of the argument against open admission, so to speak, by something that happened at an American university in the 1960s, when a group of students formed an SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. That was the left organization of the 60s. They formed an SDS, and they believed in open, no boundaries. So all the young Republicans joined SDS and voted it out of existence. So yes, communities need boundaries. Communities need, there are admissions processes. For a co-op apartment in New York, there is an admissions process. And some of us resent it, but the co-op couldn't work if there were not some criteria for membership. And I think that's true of all organizations. American citizens have to take an exam. Immigrants to the U.S. after 5 years have to take an exam, and they are quizzed about their knowledge of the Constitution. It's not a tough exam, but it is symbolic of the idea that the members of a political society have to know something about its history. So yes, I am not opposed to boundaries. Yes. Yes. I have my doubts about the state enforcement of boundaries of that sort, but I can imagine voluntary arrangements that would produce communities of like-minded people. In the United States, there was something called a covenant. When we moved to Johnstown, Pennsylvania from the Bronx, New York, we bought a house that was only available to us because the U.S. Supreme Court had just struck down the legality of a deed which says that the house can only be sold to a Christian family. And we were the beneficiaries of that Supreme Court decision. And one of our neighbors welcomed us, and another neighbor never spoke to my parents in the many years that they lived next door. So I think I would favor the state not enforcing covenants of that kind. Well, in the United States, the organization of industrial workers, starting in the late 30s, was made possible by the Wagner Act and by the National Labor Relations Board enforcing the Wagner Act, which required union elections as soon as a certain percentage of workers had signed a petition. So in my experience, the organization of industrial workers did require state assistance. I can imagine other circumstances. And I'm quite happy to hear that in Brazil there was a different, an insurgency without state aid, although I would venture to say that the success of the unions in producing greater equality in Brazil has required the election of governments that are prepared to act in the name of greater equality. Well, I've said a lot about it. I have a chapter in Spheres of Justice on the distribution of membership. And I do believe that states have a right to regulate immigration. Though I also believe that at times of desperation, refugees have a right to get in. Not necessarily here, not necessarily in any particular place. The great problem that is facing Europe today, and which is not so far being handled very well, is that the refugee crisis cannot be dealt with through the generosity of one state. There has to be a distribution of the burden, because the acceptance of desperate people is a burden, and that burden has to be distributed, and there has to be some mechanism by which all the states accept some part of the overall responsibility. But if you think of what was happening in 1938 when Leon Blum said, "You may think your country is full, but when they knock at your door, you will open it." We know the necessity that ruled at that time. And in similar conditions of necessity, we have to ask for the same response. Powerful enough to, well, I I immediately think of Oliver Wendell Holmes's remark on pornography. When I know it when I see it. I think we all know what a bad state is when we see it, and too many Jews over too long a period of time experienced it and had no difficulty recognizing it. There are criteria. We have. We want a state that accepts some constraints on the use of its power. We want states that are committed to the equality of all their citizens. We want states that have some internal mechanisms for correcting the mistakes that powerful people make, that arrogance so often produces. But we know all this. We also know that in the world today, the most miserable, the most oppressed, the most impoverished people live in failed states, divided states, states ruled by predatory governments. I have very little sympathy with those political scientists who talk about the transcendence of the Westphalian system and the coming end of the sovereign state. It seems to me the major work of people concerned with the international order is to complete the state system, not to transcend it. To make sure that everybody who needs a state has it, and to make sure that everybody who needs a state has an effective and decent state. After that, once we do that, we can talk about transcending the state system. And then I hope the transcendence does not begin with the Kurds and the Jews and the Palestinians, but begins with the French and the Norwegians. And
to thank you for the wonderful lecture. And, Michael, at the beginning you have said that this is an audience of many friends. It's also an audience of many students. And this is also an opportunity to thank you, not only for this illuminating lecture, but for everything that we have learned from you for many, many years. So thank you very much.